Hi everyone, thanks for having me. Very excited to tell you a little bit about my work on aligning human and robot representations. And this is pretty much me in a nutshell. I develop robot algorithms that learn from people, from various sorts of data from them. And I do that because I really believe that if we want robots to not just exist in a vacuum, they have to be capable to adapt to the people that they're interacting with. And as a running example, let's take this Jaco robot arm that's trying to carry this mug over to my lab mate, and maybe some of your ex-lab mate. So here, Jaco can generate trajectories I that optimize some sort of pre-specified reward function R. And typically, these reward functions are parameterized by a theta, encoding a trade-off between different features of the task. Things like the mug orientation, the distance to the table, or efficiency. And here, Jaco starts off initially only caring about being efficient, so it just follows the shortest path from start to goal. But then I eventually noticed that Jaco is actually carrying the cup a little bit too high from the table. So what I can do is I can push on it to correct it, and the robot can use my correction to adapt adapt this data and adapt to how I wanted the task to be done, and thus finish carrying the mug closer to the table to my lab mate. And this is kind of one example of robots adapting to how people want their task to be done. And in fact, I'm on this AI floor at Berkeley full of brilliant people who similarly think about getting robots to do hard tasks for humans. So in this example, they wanted to create a robot butler that can serve wine to customers. And so they came up with this. So from an AI perspective, this is an amazing feat of robotics. You get this robot that can carry this glass of wine incredibly fast without spilling, without breaking the glass or anything. Now, from a human user perspective, I don't know about you, but if this is how the robot acted around me, I would be pretty terrified. So while this robot achieves something that is very technically impressive, it kind of fails to consider that a real human customer would be too scared of their perception of the robot spilling or breaking the glass to have a good time. And so we're kind of seeing this amazing progress in getting robots to do really hard stuff in isolation, but not so much in doing those hard tasks around people necessarily. And we see the consequences of this all the time in the news. In this Uber crash in Arizona in 2018, you have this autonomous car that fatally hit a jaywalking pedestrian for the simple reason that it didn't understand the concept of a jaywalking pedestrian, that it was only programmed to know about pedestrians at crosswalks. And then on the flip side, on the right-hand side, you have this kind of the flip side scenario where this time the human didn't know about a new feature that was programmed into this flight control system. It didn't understand what it was doing, so they entered this tug of war, ultimately nosediving into the ocean. And so this kind of tells us that human-robot interaction is still very hard. And to understand the reason underlying all of these failures, I want to share with you an example of failed human-human interaction. Okay, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters? Or are they the same? The same. Okay, now watch. Now, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters? Or are they the same? That one has more quarters. That one has more quarters. Why does it have more quarters? Because it's stretched out. Okay, this is my impersonation of this child since we don't have sound. So here this child is clearly missing something, right? He's missing this concept of conservation of certain properties. Very normal for a child this age. This doesn't develop until a little bit later. But without understanding this concept, the child is making the wrong inferences to the researcher's questions. And not only that, but he's also able to explain his wrong inferences with these other concepts that he does know about that are actually quite unrelated. And so now let's take this and translate it into our Jaco example. And let's say that this time I actually want my robot to not carry the cup above my personal laptop, but the robot has no notion of distance from laptops. And without it, it can't learn well from my push, and even worse, it latches onto other concepts that it knows about, like distance to table, similarly to how that child was latching onto other concepts. So that's why, in my view, our biggest obstacle to successful human-robot interaction, should have let this play, is the fact that the representations that humans and robots have are more often than not misaligned. And that's why I spent a lot of time in my PhD working on what I call the representation alignment problem. Or in other words, how can we get robots to align their representations with those of the humans that they're interacting with and learning from? And so far we've seen kind of one more traditional approach to this, the one where you have a system designer that just hand specifies these representations, phi, and code. And then the robot can learn how to do the task on top of this by learning a reward function from task-specific input AH, like the corrections that we just saw, or many other types of feedback. And then it can optimize that to produce trajectories in the world. The only problem with this is that you need to specify ahead of time all of these features in the representation. And it's fairly unrealistic to assume that a system designer can sit and think about what every single human in any task in any environment could possibly care about ahead of time. So then you might say, Andrea, there's a very simple solution to this. Deep learning, just learn the features as well. After all, that is what the deep learning revolution has been promising us to do. And I tried that, and let's see what happens. So if the person cares about keeping the cup close to this table that we just saw and away from the laptop, we might think of the reward function spatially as looking like something like this, where it's really low when you look right above the laptop and high above from the table, and it gets better the closer to the table and farther from the laptop you look. So when the robot is missing some feature, like the distance to the laptop, deep learning just tells us that we can model what's missing with a big, deep network. You can collect a few demonstrations of how to do the task from the human, and then you can try to learn both what's missing and the reward function kind of all at once from those demonstrations. And this is kind of what happens when you do this. We see that we vaguely learn that being around the laptop is bad, but we don't really learn these more fine-grained causal details of the reward function. Now, why is that? Well, the demonstrations that we're getting, they're meant to teach the robot how to do the task. They aren't meant to teach the robot about features, per se. And so with the structure, you're just kind of hoping to pick up on what's missing implicitly from these demonstrations. But by trying to kind of do everything at once, like both of these things at once, deep learning ends up generalizing pretty poorly. And the implication is that if I now take this reward function and I optimize it, I produce this pretty suboptimal behavior in contrast to how I would have done the task. So we have one paradigm that learns good rewards but requires handcrafted representations. The other skips all that feature specification, but you do a pretty poor job generalizing. So my question has been, can we somehow bridge the gap here? Can we still have some learning involved, but recover something that's more structured and more salient? And rather than assuming a representation or just hoping that it will just pick it up along the way, a core idea in my work has been that robots should directly engage with humans in an interactive process for arriving at shared representations. And in my thesis, this has led to a divide and conquer approach to robot learning, where I'm kind of asking, can we first focus explicitly on learning the representation from human input before using that representation for learning the downstream task? So what's really nice about this is that we're not just stuck with demonstrations. We can actually design this human input AH phi that's targeted at explicitly teaching you about the representation itself and can do that effectively. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. Throughout my PhD, I've studied how to formalize this idea of representation alignment in a lot of directions, but obviously I don't have time to talk about everything, so I'm going to only show you a quick taste of just these three today, because all of these three kind of play a critical role in making this vision work. And I'll mostly focus on this first one, how do we learn representations from humans? And we're going to see the other two only kind of flashed real quick. And to see this, let's come back to this example where we had the deep inverse reinforcement learning, or IRL method, that modeled the missing feature as a neural network and collected some demonstrations to learn both what's missing and the reward kind of both at once. And what if, instead of trying to do both of these things at once, we apply this divide and conquer philosophy, and we first focus on learning the missing feature from some mystery human input that I'll tell you about in just a second, and only then focused on learning the reward on top from reward-specific inputs like the demonstrations or the corrections from earlier. And so that's what we're going to do. So we can still model the missing feature as a neural network, but what is this magical, mystical, representation-specific type of feedback that can help us learn features? Well, the most naive approach to this would be to just ask the person directly for labels representing the feature value at different states in the state space. And then you can just use these labels directly for supervision and train your neural network function directly. There's a couple problems with this. First, to cover the space, the robot would need a ton of labels, which is not super human data efficient, and it's too burdensome. But even worse, people are not exactly great at giving real valued labels. Something like 0.32 is not easy for us to express. Turns out that we can actually alleviate the second problem by instead asking the person for relative labels that kind of compare the feature values in pairs of states across the state space. And then you can train your neural network with what is called the Bradley-Terry model for pairwise comparisons. But even so, you still need a ton of comparisons. So how do we solve this problem? Well, my take on this was that humans are a lot more competent than just providing 0-1 labels, so long as we give them the right way to give us data. And so what I wanted here was to come up with some sort of feature input that is informative, but doesn't place too much sample complexity burden on the human. So our idea was that we can pack a lot more information if we instead ask the person for a sequence of states with the property that the feature values along that sequence are monotonically decreasing. And we call a sequence of this property a feature trace. And now the robot can automatically extract comparisons by exploiting this monotonicity. And I'll get into this in just a second, but first I want to show you in practice what this feature trace looks like. So in practice, if I want to teach the robot about something like distance to laptop, I start somewhere where the feature value is highly expressed, so right above the laptop, and I move the robot monotonically towards an area where it's not highly expressed, so away from the laptop. And the robot can collect a few of these traces and can learn a feature function that's defined by them. So now how does it do that? I want to walk us through how the robot can actually take advantage of this structure that's really nicely packed into these feature traces, and how it can transform those traces into these state comparisons that we can use to train the network with this Bradley-Terry model up top. So first, we know that feature traces satisfy this monotonicity property. So that means that the feature values decrease along the states of the trace. And what this means is that I can take any ordered combination of two states along the trace, and I can label it 1, meaning that I know that the first one is going to have a higher feature value than the second one. And what's really special about this is that from just one trace, I am kind of getting for free a quadratic number of state comparisons, a number of state comparisons that's quadratic in the length of the trace. And we get that for every single trace, so that's a ton of data. The second thing that I know is that I can also relate the feature values across traces, because I know that all traces approximately start high and end low. That means that for any two traces, the starts should be approximately equally high feature value-wise, and the same for the ends, where they should be approximately equally low. And that gives us equivalence tuples, with a label of 0.5 to symbolize equal preference. And so now we can take these two sets of tuples and incorporate them into a cross-entropy loss that is based off of this Bradley-Terry model, and just train this simple multi-layer perceptron for this. So now I want to showcase some actual examples of features that we managed to train using this method, using feature traces from both expert users, aka me, on a physical robot, as well as non-expert users in an kind of online user study and simulation. This happened in simulation and online because this project happened in summer of 2020, so we couldn't exactly invite people into our lab. And for all evaluations, what we can do is we can sample a test set of states in the robot's reachable set, and we can color them with the value of the feature that we're trying to visualize. So here, I'm coloring the distance to laptop feature, and we see that it's yellow when the end effector is right above the laptop, and it goes towards blue when you go away. And something else that's nice that I can do is I can take this 3D ball and project it onto a representative plane, like so. Okay, so when we look at the ground truth laptop feature, we see this projected feature density ball that kind of decreases the farther away you look from the laptop center. And when we collect traces from the expert, our method learns a structurally very similar feature. And in fact, this holds across 6 different Euclidean features that we looked at. I'm not going to get into detail of what these are, but what I do want to point out is that each of these features was trained with somewhere around 10 to 15 feature traces, not the 1,000 demonstrations that end-to-end methods might have required. And I want to also show some qualitative results from our user study, because ultimately we wanted to know, does this work with real people who are not experts? Can real people actually program their robots in their home to do this? And so what we're seeing is for distance to laptop, real users, so non-expert users, gave these traces that also similarly start at the center and move away from the laptop in all directions. And you can recover this projected ball that looks very similar to what we saw on the previous slide. For distance to table, they cover the space vertically from up to down. And my personal favorite is this proxemics feature, which is this idea that people really dislike having things in front of their face more so than to their sides. And so my favorite thing is that people figured out on their own that the way to teach this is to give these traces that are longer in front of them and then shorter and shorter to their sides. And so you recover this kind of half ellipsis when you project it. That's kind of consistent with my description of the proxemics feature. This idea of learning features efficiently from human supervision, we managed to actually generalize this to more complex settings, not just Euclidean settings. So we generalized it to perceptual features, which the robot can learn and use directly from camera input. And we also looked at emotion features, which the robot can use to produce expressive motion. All right, so now that we've seen how we can learn features one at a time, I want to ask the question, how does the robot even know when its representation is misaligned with the humans in the first place and thus needs to learn features? So that's what we're going to quickly go over in this second part. And going back to this scenario, recall that without knowing about this feature, the robot kind of blindly learned to stay close to the table, which is not what I wanted it to do. So instead, is there any way in which the robot can kind of autonomously figure out that it is missing something, that it doesn't, that my push refers to something that it just doesn't know about? So that's what we're going to ask here. And since people, when they act, they don't just do so randomly, we used what is called the Boltzmann-Noisily rational model, which models people as selecting inputs in proportion to their exponentiated reward. And what's really nice about this model is this coefficient beta over here, which models how optimal or rational the person is. And typically in robotics, this beta is fixed to be something reasonably high, essentially assuming that people will be reasonably rational. But since here we're trying to explicitly detect misalignment, we know that from the robot's perspective, that's not necessarily going to be the case. And so we didn't do that here. And instead, we estimated this beta. We reinterpreted it as a confidence in how much the robot can explain the human's input. And we estimated both beta and theta. So what this means is that when the human and robot representations are aligned, the robot can estimate a high confidence on the correct intent theta that explains the human's input. And thus, it can learn assuredly from what the human is doing. But when they are misaligned, the robot estimates a low confidence across its representation and does not learn from inputs that it does not understand. So going back to this example, this time when I push on the robot, it infers a low confidence. And as you can see in orange, it doesn't incorrectly learn to stay close to the table. Importantly, this is not something that we hand tune. The robot kind of is automatically monitoring its confidence, and it can learn in proportion to that confidence, as it did here, or you could just completely stop execution entirely in safety-critical situations. I'm going to skip some user study videos that I have in the interest of time, but I quickly wanted to just point out that this framework generalizes beyond corrections. We did this for learning from demonstrations. We did this for teleoperation. So this is something that generalizes much, much broadly. And lastly, to then properly learn from and interpret people's input, you also need a model for how people make choices. I'm not going to dive deep into this, But we did find that this Boltzmann model that I just introduced, it's actually quite unintuitive. And we presented this more natural model called LESS, where we said that we should use the human-aligned representation to kind of account for any similarity that the potential trajectories have to one another. Long story short, we ran a user study, and we confirmed that our model does indeed better capture how people make decisions. And this has implications beyond robotics to cognitive science and econometrics and anywhere you need a human model. So all in all, when you put everything together and you go back and try to do reward learning, what you see is that with our divide and conquer approach, we recover much more generalizable rewards when compared to end-to-end, which was completely failing. I don't know if can I have like 2 minutes to talk about high-level stuff, or should I wrap it up with 1 minute? Okay. All right. Well, the robot here, now that it's aligned, it can do the task how I wanted it. But what I wanted to talk about really quickly is that we sort of put forward this vision of getting robots to engage with humans in this interactive process for arriving at shared representations. But in these 20 minutes, we really just talked about this very standard approach where the human is the teacher feeding the robot data about their representation. In reality, what I would really love to have in seamless human-robot interaction and collaboration would be more than just passive data absorption, but more like this bidirectional process where the robot is actually an active participant in the interaction. And so this is kind of a vision for like where representation alignment should go in the future. It should be this more active bidirectional process. Okay, I'm not going to go too in-depth into this, but you can see this in personal robotics where robots work alongside humans. You need representation alignment to enable the robot to easily learn new things, new tasks from humans as the context changes. But you also need to enable the robot to communicate back its failures to the human so that it's more transparent in the case of failure. And semi-autonomous driving, we would really love for the robot to behave according to user expectations. And if it doesn't, like in that aircraft example, then it should detect that and relinquish control to the pilot. And this isn't specific to just experienced pilots. We want autonomy that can adapt to users of all different levels of expertises and preferences. I also envision AVs also interacting with the passengers themselves. I'm sure maybe some of you know there's Waymo cars going on in San Francisco. I got to try one, and my HRI brain kept looking at this interface and thinking that there's so much potential for personalization, and this car could really learn a lot about me. And lastly, there's a lot of potential for shared autonomy, which is meant to assist and augment human performance, where the robot should really adapt to different changing human capabilities as the person learns more and more about how to use it. It's their robot. Okay, all of these exciting avenues are possible because we're explicitly sitting down and thinking about aligning representations rather than just hoping it's going to naturally emerge. I'd like to thank my collaborators and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. It was amazing. Great talk. I had a question about the learning the representations when you had this the features. When you had the laptop experiment, you're learning those features one by one, right?
Sorry.
For the laptop, for example, you're in the table and you're doing these, like collecting these data for only one feature at a time. Is that correct?
Yes, one feature at a time.
How easy is to combine those features? Because you are kind of like, are you assuming that they're starting from the same value? And would that be true all the time?
Are you saying how can you combine them into a reward function? Because what if they live on different intense values? Yeah.
So what if you want to really avoid the laptop, but not
we
as
kind
much?
of normalize them to be between 0 and 1.
Okay.
That's how we normalize the training to be between 0 and 1, where 1 is the kind of highest intensity. That just makes the reward learning easier. But I mean, it's not mandatory.
Okay.
You don't have to do that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
It definitely has to be positive, though.
All right, and well, in that case, I thank you. And thanks, Speaker again.
Thank you.